Tom Rivett-Carnac's the co-founder of Global Optimism, along with Christiana Figueres, who was the UN chair when the Paris Accord was signed. Tom joins us from Totnes in Devon, and that's in the UK. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. As somebody who has been at the front lines and at the heart of this debate, how have the last few years felt to you?
Well, obviously, the last few years have been very disappointing in the sense that the United States announced its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement soon after President Trump took office. And at that time, we were all extremely concerned that that would precipitate a wider number of countries coming out and declaring that they would also not meet their Paris commitments. However, the good news there is that despite President Trump pulling back on US leadership, no other countries came out to step back from their Paris commitments. And now, of course, what we're seeing is a return to international leadership by the United States, which we're confident we'll see under the stewardship of President-elect Biden and climate envoy John Kerry. Of course, the other thing that's happened in the last few years, and this was referenced in your pre-roll, is that the impacts of climate change have just become exponentially worse. We're now seeing continents on fire. We're seeing real serious impacts from climate change, and we're seeing real anger on the streets. So the recipe for some major change is now in place.
We have, of course, as Nick was mentioning, seen many countries, particularly poor countries around the world, being hit hard by COVID-19. Is it realistic to think that countries in those circumstances dealing with the economic fallout of COVID-19 are actually in a position to be able to look realistically and logically at dealing with climate change first?
Well, the first thing we need to remember, of course, is that climate change is fundamentally unfair, and it's been predominantly caused by a subset of countries, which is the industrialized North, a point made very powerfully just a few minutes ago by Prime Minister Modi in the Climate Ambition Summit. However, the Paris Agreement is very clear that every country has responsibility to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, the recovery from COVID is an opportunity to now reinvest in our economies, reinvest in infrastructure, to get people back to work and invest in jobs. We have the technology necessary to actually now deal with the climate crisis. And the good news is, and this is one of the major changes since Paris, is the economics has moved fundamentally in our favor. It is now good economics to invest in renewable sources of energy, to drive down emissions, to invest in nature, to make these sorts of changes. So I would argue that actually investing in the future is a fundamental part of how all countries, including developing countries, can and should recover from the COVID pandemic.
If people in any country are not convinced that the government of their country is actually going to be doing enough, what can they do as individuals in order to at least feel that they're doing their part?
So recently, my friend and colleague Christiana Figueres and I wrote a book called The Future We Choose, and in that we set out 3 different actions that we would encourage everyone to take. The first is to realize that this is the most decisive decade in human history. That sounds like an exaggeration to say that, but it's really not. By 2030, we will either have gotten on top of this issue or we will have lost control of the climatic system. So the first thing for each of us to do is to decide that we will face this decade with determination and commitment and really be part of making a difference to see it through and make a change. There's a lot of anxiety and fear now, but we don't need to give in to anxiety and fear. We can face this with determination and optimism. The second thing is to look at your own footprint. That can be very significant for individuals. And if you look at it in terms of what you can achieve in 10 years, particularly those in countries that are emitting the most, the industrialized countries, you can drive that footprint down very significantly. That can have a big impact overall, but also it will encourage you to do more. And critically, the third part is how you engage with power. Each individual needs to look at their roles in their lives as a citizen, as a voter, as an investor, as somebody who purchases goods and services, as an employee, and engage with power in all of those ways to actually exert some influence and demand that while we can, we get on top of this issue.
Tom Rivett-Carnac is co-founder of Global Optimism, and it's good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And you can watch our extended interview with the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Patricia Espinosa. That's at 08:30 GMT on Sunday. Talk to Al Jazeera.